Some tears aren't for laughter. When Steve Carell walked onto the Tonight Show stage with his characteristic warmth and that familiar, gentle smile that had made him America's favorite awkward boss, nobody expected him to reveal the most heartbreaking secret of his post-office life. Jimmy Fallon had planned a standard promotional interview for Steve's latest film. The audience was ready for the subtle humor and endearing awkwardness that always came with a Steve Carell appearance. But what Steve was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that sometimes the people who make us laugh carry the deepest understanding of our pain. The cameras were rolling. The audience was already smiling in anticipation. And then Steve spoke 14 words that changed everything. I write letters to families when their loved ones die, especially my fans. What came next wasn't just television. It was a revelation about grief, compassion, and the unexpected burden of fame that would leave Jimmy speechless and redefine what it means to truly care about the people who make your career possible. Steve Carell had always been known for his empathy, both on and off screen. Even his most oblivious character, Michael Scott from The Office, was fundamentally well-intentioned despite his countless social missteps. But what audiences didn't know was that Steve's real-life empathy had been deepened by an unexpected consequence of fame, the intimate access it gave him to other people's grief. It had started 6 years earlier, shortly after The Office ended, and Steve was transitioning to movie roles. Fan mail had always been part of his life, but as his fame grew, the letters became more personal, more revealing, more heartbreaking. Along with the typical requests for autographs and expressions of appreciation, Steve began receiving letters from families who were dealing with loss and wanted to share how his work had provided comfort during their darkest moments. My husband died last month, and we used to watch The Office together every night, one letter had read. It was the only thing that could make him laugh during his cancer treatment. I still watch it, and it feels like he's still here with me. Another, my teenage daughter loved Jim and Pam's relationship. She died in a car accident last week, and I keep thinking about how she'll never get her own fairy tale romance. Watching your show is the only thing that doesn't make me cry right now. These letters had affected Steve profoundly. Here were people in the midst of unimaginable grief, taking time to write to a stranger because his work had somehow provided a moment of lightness in their darkness. The responsibility of that connection had overwhelmed him, but more than that, it had awakened something in him that went far beyond professional obligation. I realized that when people invite you into their living rooms every week for years, you become part of their family in a way, Steve later explained. And when families are grieving, they sometimes reach out to anyone who feels familiar, anyone who represents happier times. Steve's first response had been a simple thank you note to a widow whose husband had been a huge fan of The Office. But as he wrote, he found himself sharing more than just gratitude for her support. He found himself acknowledging her loss, expressing genuine sorrow for her pain, offering the kind of comfort that one human being provides to another during life's most difficult moments. I didn't plan to become someone who writes condolence letters, Steve said, but when someone trusts you with their grief, when they share something so personal and painful, you can't just send a form letter back. You have to respond with the same honesty they've shown you. That first letter had led to another, then another. Steve began setting aside time each week to personally respond to fan mail that contained news of death, illness, or family tragedy. These weren't brief notes dashed off by an assistant. They were carefully crafted, handwritten letters that acknowledged each person's specific loss and offered genuine comfort. Dear Margaret, one of Steve's letters read, I was deeply saddened to learn about the loss of your husband, Robert. You mentioned that he laughed at Michael Scott's antics even during his final days in the hospital, and I'm honored that something I was part of could bring him moments of joy during such a difficult time. Please know that Robert's memory and your love for him has touched me deeply. While I know that nothing can fill the space he's left behind, I hope you can find comfort in knowing that his capacity for laughter, even in his darkest moments, says something beautiful about the kind of man he was. The letters were deeply personal, often running several pages, and always addressed the specific circumstances of each family's loss. Steve would research the deceased person when family members mentioned their interests or occupations, adding personal touches that showed he had truly listened to their stories. When a mother wrote to tell me that her son had died by suicide and that the office was the only thing that could still make her smile, I spent 3 hours writing back to her, Steve remembered. I shared some of my own experiences with depression, talked about how humor can be both a coping mechanism and a bridge to healing, and tried to honor her son's memory by acknowledging that his struggle was real and that his life had mattered. Over 6 years, Steve's condolence correspondence had grown into a substantial part of his life. He estimated that he had written personal letters to 127 families, responding to deaths that ranged from illness and accidents to suicide and violence. Each letter was unique, tailored to the specific loss and the specific way that his work had intersected with that family's grief. I started keeping a private file of these letters, Steve explained, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted to remember each person who had trusted me with their pain. These aren't just fan letters, they're sacred communications about the most important experiences in human life. The emotional impact on Steve had been significant. Reading about loss after loss, week after week, had given him an intimate understanding of grief that most people never develop. He had learned about the different ways people mourn, the various stages of processing loss, the particular pain of unexpected death versus prolonged illness. It changed how I think about comedy, about entertainment, about the responsibility that comes with being in people's homes and hearts, Steve said. When you understand how much comfort your work can provide during the worst moments of someone's life, you start to take that role more seriously. But more than just changing his perspective on his career, the letter writing had changed Steve as a person. The constant exposure to other people's grief had made him more aware of the fragility of life, more grateful for his own family, and more committed to treating every interaction with kindness because he never knew what someone might be going through. I've written to parents who lost children, children who lost parents, spouses who lost partners, siblings who lost each other, Steve said. Every possible kind of loss, every possible kind of family structure. What they all have in common is this need to be seen, to have their grief acknowledged, to know that their loved one's life mattered to someone beyond their immediate circle. Steve's approach to these letters was methodical and thoughtful. He would read each piece of mail carefully, often multiple times, taking notes about the specific details that family members shared. He would then draft his response by hand, revising and editing until he felt he had captured the right tone and message. Finally, he would write the final version in his own handwriting, believing that a personal touch was essential for such intimate communication. I never use a computer for these letters, Steve explained. Grief deserves handwriting. It deserves the time and effort it takes to form each word individually. It deserves the imperfection and humanity that comes with pen and paper. The letters weren't just expressions of sympathy, they were attempts to create connection and meaning from loss. Steve often shared memories or observations about the deceased person based on what family members had told him. He would highlight qualities that seemed to have defined their loved one's life, offering perspectives that might help families see their loss in a larger context. When a father wrote to tell me that his daughter had died in a car accident and that she had dreamed of working in television comedy, I didn't just express condolence. Steve remembered. I wrote about how her dream showed that she understood something important about the power of laughter to heal and connect people. I suggested that even though she didn't get to pursue that career, her love of comedy was part of what made her special, and that her family could honor her memory by continuing to find joy and laughter in their own lives. Steve's condolence work had remained completely private until a journalist investigating celebrity fan mail practices had stumbled across references to his letters and interviews with grieving families. The families, grateful for Steve's kindness, had mentioned his responses when asked about sources of comfort during their mourning process. But Steve had been adamant about keeping this work out of the public eye, not wanting it to seem like a publicity stunt or to exploit the vulnerable families he was trying to help. He had turned down interview requests about the letters and had asked his management team to keep this aspect of his life separate from his professional image. Tonight's appearance on The Tonight Show was supposed to be standard promotional fare for Steve's latest film, a heartwarming comedy about family relationships. Jimmy had planned to ask about the movie, maybe reminisce about The Office, definitely tap into Steve's gentle humor that always made for good television. But something about the film's themes of family and connection had made Steve more reflective than usual about his own experiences with other people's families. The interview had started exactly as expected. Steve had walked out to enthusiastic applause, settled into the guest chair with his characteristic modesty, and begun discussing his new film with the kind of thoughtful humor that made him such a beloved guest. Jimmy had asked about working with the cast, about the film's message, about Steve's own family experiences that had informed his performance. But when Jimmy brought up The Office and asked about Michael Scott's famous lack of empathy, something shifted in Steve's expression. The question had been meant as a light-hearted setup for discussing character development, but it had touched on something deeper that Steve had been thinking about a lot lately. "You know, Jimmy," Steve said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "playing Michael Scott for all those years taught me a lot about empathy, actually. Not because Michael had it, but because I realized how important it is to really see and understand other people's experiences." The audience grew slightly quieter, sensing that Steve was moving into more reflective territory than his usual gentle humor. Jimmy leaned forward with genuine interest. "What do you mean by that?" Steve was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "Well, since The Office ended, I've had a lot of interactions with fans, and I've learned that people sometimes reach out to entertainers during the most difficult moments of their lives. They write letters when they're grieving, when they're struggling, when they need to connect with something that represents better times." The studio was now completely focused on Steve's words, the energy shifting from anticipatory laughter to attentive listening. "And I realized that just saying thank you for watching wasn't enough," Steve continued. "When someone trusts you with their pain, when they tell you about losing someone they love, you have to respond with the same honesty and care they've shown you." Jimmy was clearly moved by Steve's sincerity. "Steve, are you saying you personally respond to fan mail about loss and grief?" Steve took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. "Jimmy, can I tell you about something I've been doing for the past 6 years? Something I don't usually talk about publicly?" "Of course," Jimmy replied, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Steve's voice became softer, more vulnerable. "I write personal letters to families when their loved ones die, especially when those families tell me that my work somehow provided comfort during their loss." The audience fell completely silent. Jimmy's expression changed from curious to deeply moved as he began to understand what Steve was describing. "You write condolence letters to fans' families?" Jimmy asked softly. "I write letters to people who are grieving," Steve corrected gently. "People who have lost parents, children, spouses, siblings. People who reach out because comedy was one of the last things that connected them to their loved one, or because laughter is one of the few things that still brings them comfort." Jimmy felt tears forming in his eyes. "Steve, that's... how many letters have you written?" 127 over 6 years, Steve said, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his mission. Each one handwritten, each one personal, each one trying to honor both the person who died and the family member who trusted me with their grief. The audience was completely silent now, witnessing a side of Steve Carell they had never seen before, Not the awkward Michael Scott, not even the gentle comedian, but a man who had discovered a calling in comforting strangers during their darkest moments. "Can you tell us about one of these letters?" Jimmy asked, his voice thick with emotion. Steve smiled sadly. "There was a mother named Carol, whose teenage daughter had died in a car accident. The daughter had been a huge fan of The Office, and Carol wrote to tell me that watching our show was the only thing that didn't make her cry anymore. She said her daughter used to quote Michael Scott lines, and hearing them brought back happy memories." Steve's voice grew tender as he continued. "I wrote back to Carol and told her that her daughter's love of comedy showed that she understood something important about finding joy, even in difficult times. I said that her daughter's laughter was a gift she had given to everyone around her, and that Carol could honor her memory by continuing to find moments of joy, even in grief." Jimmy was openly crying now. "What did Carol write back?" "She said that my letter helped her see her daughter's laughter as a legacy rather than just a memory," Steve said, tears visible in his own eyes. "She started volunteering with a children's comedy program at her local theater, saying she wanted to help other kids discover the kind of joy her daughter had found in humor." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical talk show applause. It was recognition, respect, acknowledgement that they were witnessing something profound. "Steve," Jimmy said, wiping his eyes, "you've taken your success and turned it into a ministry for grieving families. That's not just kindness, that's calling. It's responsibility," Steve replied. "When people invite you into their homes, when they find comfort in your work during the worst moments of their lives, you have an obligation to honor that trust. Comedy gave me a platform, but grief taught me how to use it meaningfully." Jimmy looked at Steve with new respect. "How do you handle it emotionally? Reading about loss after loss, week after week?" "It's changed me," Steve admitted. "I'm more aware of how precious life is, more grateful for my own family, more committed to treating every person with kindness because I never know what they might be going through." Steve's voice grew more passionate as he continued, "But it's also been a privilege. These families have taught me about resilience, about love that survives death, about the healing power of being seen and heard in your pain. I've learned more about humanity from their letters than from any role I've ever played." Jimmy made a decision that would become one of the most emotional moments in Tonight Show history. "Steve, you mentioned that your letters sometimes inspire people to find new ways to honor their loved ones. Do we have any examples of that?" Steve smiled through his tears. "Actually, Carol is here tonight. She flew in from Ohio because she wanted to thank me in person." The camera found Carol in the audience, a woman in her 50s who stood up with obvious emotion when her name was called. The visual of the mother who had transformed her grief into service was immediately powerful. "Carol, would you like to come up here?" Jimmy asked. Carol made her way to the stage with the kind of dignity that comes from surviving unimaginable loss and finding purpose in pain. When she reached Steve, the reunion was immediate and emotional, a hug between a griever and a comforter that represented years of correspondence and healing. "Tell everyone what Steve's letter meant to you," Jimmy said gently. "When my daughter Emma died, I thought laughter would never feel right again," Carol said into the microphone with surprising composure. "But Steve's letter helped me understand that Emma's joy was her gift to the world and that I could honor her by helping other children discover that same gift." Carol paused, looking at Steve with obvious affection. "Steve didn't just send me a sympathy card. He helped me transform my grief into purpose. Because of his letter, I've been teaching children's theater for 3 years now, and I've watched dozens of kids discover the healing power of laughter." The audience was on their feet now, applauding not just for Steve's compassion, but for Carol's transformation and courage. As the segment concluded with this unexpected reunion, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience remained standing for over 5 minutes, not just applauding, but recognizing that they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment. Steve's revelation about his condolence correspondence became one of the most shared Tonight Show segments in the program's history, but more importantly, it inspired a national conversation about grief, compassion, and the responsibility that comes with public platforms. Grief counselors across the country praised Steve's approach to condolence letters, with many incorporating his techniques into their training programs. Other celebrities began sharing their own experiences with fan mail from grieving families, and some started their own programs of personal response to loss. But perhaps the most significant impact came from the hundreds of families who reached out to share their own stories of loss and healing, many crediting Steve's example with helping them understand that grief could be transformed into connection and service to others. 6 months later, Steve was invited back to The Tonight Show for a follow-up segment. He brought with him a collection of thank you notes from families whose lives had been touched by his letters, notes that prove that sometimes the most important work happens far from cameras and applause. This is what change looks like, Steve told the audience, holding up the handwritten notes. When you respond to someone's grief with genuine compassion, you don't just comfort them, you show them that their loved one's life mattered enough for a stranger to care. Steve continues his condolence correspondence, now with support from his management team and formal partnerships with grief counseling organizations. His file of letters has grown to include over 200 families, each representing a sacred trust between a public figure and private grief. Sometimes the most important performances happen off stage, in the quiet moments when a comedian becomes a comforter, when entertainment becomes ministry, when fame becomes a tool for healing rather than just success. Steve Carell proved that true empathy means more than understanding fictional characters. It means caring enough about real people to share their pain and help carry their grief. Today, hundreds of families across the country have handwritten letters from Steve Carell tucked away in their most precious possessions, not as celebrity memorabilia, but as proof that someone cared enough to see their loss, honor their loved one, and remind them that they are not alone in their grief. That's not just good comedy, that's good humanity, demonstrated by one man who understood that making people laugh is important, but helping them heal is sacred.